Well, welcome everyone to this online seminar, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My name is Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and I've also published a fair amount about monarchy and the Commonwealth. You may not have noticed it from today's headlines, but today is Commonwealth Day. You probably haven't noticed, you might not have noticed it, you could well not have noticed it, because the headlines have been dominated by the little local difficulties within the House of Windsor at the moment. And actually, when the history of those little local difficulties comes to be written, Commonwealth Day will figure at least two separate Commonwealth Days. Commonwealth Day 2020 was the last time Harry and Meghan appeared with the firm at a major public event. And it was also apparently the occasion of a snub, and there seems to have been many snubs or certainly taken as snubs along the way. In terms of the choreography of that event, if the Harry and Meghan camp are to be believed. Move forward to 2021, Commonwealth Day, and we are in the middle of a bit of a media feeding frenzy around an interview that Harry and Meghan have given to Oprah Winfrey, which was shown in the United States last night, and is due to be broadcast at 9 o'clock this evening in the UK. Commonwealth Day has been rather crowded out by that. There was no Commonwealth service in the Abbey, a tradition that has been going at Westminster Abbey since 1973. Instead, the BBC broadcast a special celebration of the Commonwealth, as it was called, yesterday evening, dominating the hour-long programme. From its opening images of various Commonwealth visits by the Queen, was the Queen herself and other members of her family, with the Queen's own Commonwealth Day message and separate appearances by Charles, Camilla, William and Kate, even Sophie Wessex, talking to some Queen's young leaders who rather jarringly referred to as Mom throughout. For the media, it seems that the Commonwealth is simply a subcategory of royal coverage. Why is this link still so strong in 2021? And is this good for the Commonwealth? To discuss this, we have a distinguished panel of academic historians of monarchy, decolonization, and the Crown. We might touch upon the Oprah Winfrey interview, but we won't be pretending to have seen it in advance. And we won't be mentioning the Balham Donkey Sanctuary. So don't worry, this is a very respectable academic event. I'm delighted to introduce our panel of speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Anna Whitlock, who's reader in early modern history and director of the London Centre for Public History and Heritage at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's the author of an acclaimed biography of Mary Tudor and of Elizabeth's Bedfellows, an intimate history of the Queen's court. She is also principal investigator on a major AHRC funded research project called The Visible Crown, Queen Elizabeth II and the Caribbean, 1952 to the present. And her fellow panelists, Alice Hunt, Kate Quinn, and indeed myself, are all associated with that research project, which will start towards the middle of this year. Dr. Alice Hunt is Associate Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture at the University of Southampton. She is the author of The Drama of Coronation, Medieval Ceremony in Early Modern England, and co-editor with Anna Whitlock of a collection of essays on Tudor queenship, the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth. And I think it's great to have that early modern expertise, that kind of comparative expertise on the monarchy when we're thinking about contemporary monarchy. Dr. Harshan Kumasingham is Senior Lecturer in British Politics at the University of Edinburgh. He's author of A Political Legacy of the British Empire, Power and the Parliamentary System in Post-Colonial India and Sri Lanka, and of an earlier book, Onward with Executive Power, Lessons from New Zealand. It would take far too long to read out titles of all the books he's edited, which is an extraordinary list of books on constitutional history, but the most recent is Viceregalism, the Crown as Head of State in Political Crises in the Post-War Commonwealth. And one of the contributors to that book is our fourth panelist, Dr. Kate Quinn, who is Associate Professor in Caribbean History at the Institute of the Americas, UCL. Kate is a specialist on the cultural, intellectual, and constitutional history of the Caribbean. Her publications include Beyond Westminster in the Caribbean with Brian Meeks, Black Power in the Caribbean, and Politics and Power in Haiti with Paul Sutton. Finally, we have Dr. Ed Owens, who is a historian of modern British monarchy and the media, and author of a recent book, The Family Firm, Monarchy, Mass Media and the British Public, 1932 to 53. Highly recommended. It's my well-thumbed copy. It covers a period which you may think is quite familiar to you, but you will find that Ed remarkably has been able to find a rich seam of new material on the period from the end of George V's reign to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Highly recommended. So it's wonderful to have such a distinguished panel with us. And I'm going to really ask them each in turn, just to give us some opening remarks about monarchy, royalty, and the Commonwealth. The BBC clearly think, on the basis of the programme last night, that monarchy is central to the Commonwealth. Why has it survived so strongly? Why is the association still so strong in 2021? Anna, can I start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Sorry, Philip. Patrick, thank you, Philip, for inviting me onto the panel. And yeah, I'm delighted to be the principal investigator on this Visible Crown project, which Kate, Philip, Alice, and indeed Harshan are involved with. Yeah, I come at this as a historian of monarchy more generally. I now am director of a new Centre for Modern Monarchy at Royal Holloway. And I have been actually feeding the media today, giving them various bits and bobs to comment on Harry and Meghan, which, as Philip said, isn't directly relevant here, but in some sense, I think it is. And I do think there may well be echoes in terms of how people perceive of the monarchy, the royal family in and around the Commonwealth. Although I note today, just very briefly, that I think the New Zealand Morning Herald had 60% of Kiwis supporting the Queen on her side. Similarly, in Australia, there was an op-ed which was sort of talking about Meghan Markle's starring acting performance as Diana Mark II. So clearly there's a spectrum of opinion here, I think, which is quite interesting, which we might unpack. But reflecting on Philip's question of why the continued association of the Queen and the Commonwealth, or the monarchy in the Commonwealth, and is it good for the Commonwealth? Well, I mean, I'd answer those two questions directly by saying, I think why it's basically the Queen is the answer. For her, it is personal, and for her, it is family. I absolutely think the legacy from her father is absolutely integral. She pledged in that, infamous speech on her 21st birthday, which, I returned to again and again. This was a debut broadcast from Cape Town, where she talked about a life of service that she pledged. That she said, I've got the quote, which I use all the time and I can't find it now. But she pledged, I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. And I do think that is really key to understanding the Queen's identity as head of the Commonwealth, her relationship with the Commonwealth. It's defined her reign. I mean, it really is a link to her father, which we really need to understand. Of course, we have seen transition through her reign. We've seen, for example, the accession proclamation. It admitted reference to the imperial crown, employed instead the term the head of the Commonwealth. And then right after the coronation, we saw the Queen embarking on this huge 40,000-mile Commonwealth tour. The Commonwealth has been really important to her. Her first Christmas Day broadcast as Queen was from Auckland, and she talked about this sort of entirely new conception of the Commonwealth. It's not about the empires of the past. It's all about friendship and loyalty and peace and freedom. I would say, though, that actually for all the reasons why it's personal to the Queen, is the reasons why it's not good for the Commonwealth. I mean, I think anybody who watched that programme last night, it was basically the Commonwealth through the eyes of the royals in the UK. And I think in a sense that is absolutely the problem with it. Yes, the royals, the Queen gives the Commonwealth a platform, and who else would be, who would replace her as head of the Commonwealth that would give her a similar profile? But I think, both literally and metaphorically last night, the royals were shown to be out of touch because of the pandemic, quite obviously. But in every other way, it was really, really difficult to watch in many ways. And also the irony, I think, finally, of so much of the Queen and indeed the royal family's descriptions of the Commonwealth is around family. They talk about, I mean, Charles talked about the essence of the Commonwealth is diversity, how they want to embrace people of, different cultures, different talents. And of course, I was watching that with the echoes of Harry and Meghan and, Meghan's charges against the royal family, ringing in my ears, that she represented diversity in a way that, much was hoped for. And indeed, Harry and Meghan were going to play a role in the Commonwealth. They were going to be seen as the Queen's ambassadors there. They could have literally brought colour into the royal family. And so I think with their departure, and not only their departure, but obviously their stinging rebuke and the charges of racism, it really raises questions about the role that the monarchy can play going forward. And perhaps it just gives further oxygen to questions about, to who are they representing? What are they for? And what do they do? And that really was struck me in the conversations last night. And not least, of course, as Philip said, the reference to mom all the time. I mean, that just said everything about what's wrong with the Commonwealth. The people that are doing the work and are out on the front line are, down the line, but the people that are being showing the respect are the royals with the deference of mom. That said a lot to me. So no, not a good thing for the Commonwealth going forward, I think, once the Queen has passed on.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. Alice, over to you.
Hello, yes, and thank you, Philip, for inviting me to be part of this panel, and a really interesting set of questions and set off by the programme yesterday. I should preface my remarks with the fact that I also come to this with a kind of historical perspective, and I'm particularly interested in the kind of performative aspect of monarchy. And with the kind of symbolism, which is increasingly important, I think, with something like the Commonwealth, that she is a sort of symbol of the head of the Commonwealth, and the tours and the pageantry and the performances that accompany her visibility in the Commonwealth are seemingly benign, often flag waving, songs, welcoming, triumphant, happy. But I think there's always more to those kinds of events. And in a similar way, I thought that was sort of going on in the programme last night, that it seemed that there was this kind of benign representation of the monarchy. But there was something uncomfortable, I think, as well. There was something very comfortable about their nice houses that they were sitting on, and then talking to the people, and they really didn't seem to know. They were being told about what was happening. I couldn't see their work. So in the sense of what are they doing, the programme, I think, didn't communicate that very well. Like Anna, the question, why is there such a strong connection? And what did the programme do with that? Well, like Anna, I think it was a sense of the history and a promise. And I was really struck by the opening of the programme with the Dean of Westminster and Anita standing in front of the coronation chair, and I saw it immediately. And eventually the Dean of Westminster refers to it and refers to the promise that she made at her coronation to sort of take care, really, of the Commonwealth countries. And of course, she had her coronation dress with the 8 nations as they were at the time and all their flowers. And it picks up again on the promise that she made in 1947 in the speech which Anna has just talked about, where she talks about this imperial family. And as if the Commonwealth has always been, this ancient Commonwealth, it's always been like this. And often coverage of the Commonwealth, and I think the tours and the way in which the tours are kind of are described, it's often in terms of this sort of continuity and duty. And I think that's something perhaps we could unpack. I mean, Charles says in the ITV documentary on the Commonwealth, no one really understands duty. And so perhaps we could, think about that, the sort of this sense of duty that they have to the nations, which is increasingly problematic. There's something sort of this sort of way we've got to look after them or something. This relationship of patronage. The second part of the question is, why is that connection so important? Well, I was thinking, well, important for whom? And I think the programme, and more generally, perhaps, it is something that's personal and quite emotional. It's always talked about as kind of a passion of the Queen's. And I think there's a disentangling to be done between her role as head of the Commonwealth and as Queen. And they're often blurred. She's not Queen in all of the Commonwealth nations, but she's talked about as our Queen. And that was in the programme yesterday. So there's a blurring of the identities there. And I think the stress on family and then the kind of succession, which is being played out, that it will go to Charles, and then clearly, as the programme said, it's then going to go to William and Kate. That there is implicit, and this I suppose is what's not so benign underneath it. Implicit is that it is in their, it is in their family, and that might be for some of the realms. But why should the head of the Commonwealth be a hereditary role? I don't think I don't think that's sustainable. So no, I also think that there's some real scrutiny to be done of the role of the monarchy in the future of the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much indeed. Harshan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you everyone for having me here today for this fascinating panel that you put together. Thank you again, Philip. Well, the first thing I got from, I must say, watching this program was a great deal of homesickness. I dearly wished I was in New Zealand and that wonderful open space that was there. And it was lovely hearing Kiwi voices again in that little segment there. But I more broadly than that, I suppose I not that I have much interest, I must say, about what Harry and Meghan are up to be brutally frank, but it reminded me of some of the conversation that has been happening at the moment about an interview they had given last year about how the Commonwealth needs to acknowledge colonialism, and to be honest, it was of course colonialism must be acknowledged, but I thought it was interesting that they, at least in my view as someone who is an historian of the Commonwealth, that saw almost a very little appreciation of what the Commonwealth is and how it differentiates from, say, the British Empire, which is a completely different regime type, whereas the Commonwealth is a voluntary one, a very imperfect organization, but it is a voluntary organization. And it made me think, so Anna mentioned about the Queen's 21st birthday speech, and I was thinking in some ways the year later, in 1948, when the Queen's father is on the throne, but then for the first time there are non-white leaders at the Commonwealth meeting in London, the leaders of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and not long later, there's this, this move to allow republics in 1949 onwards, with India wishing, and that did transform things. And I think it's and it was a great risk that the Commonwealth and monarchy took with that, because there was not the same constitutional ties, but there were, of course, strong cultural ones, which we saw in yesterday's performance. And it in some ways also, I mean, this is perhaps an extremely dull thing to say, but it's yesterday's performance. I mean, as purely in terms of aesthetics and music, I enjoyed it. But in terms of the messages that I'm perhaps meant to take on, I'm a failed case, because I saw this purely as Britain's Commonwealth Day. I did not see it as a Commonwealth Day. And as an example of that, which is not a mitigation, is that all the different Commonwealth capitals also have Commonwealth Day. It's just they're not broadcast on the iPlayer. So they have their own thing and they do their own thing. So this is Britain's version of it, and that's in some respects natural, and also confusing and somewhat disappointing, you could argue as well. But it did bring home to me, with some of the points that have been made already, about how so much of the Commonwealth and so much of the monarchy is seen very much through not just the British lens, but almost through a London lens. And there's very little appreciation of the wide import of the organization in terms of its various activities, cultural, sporting, technical, educational, and so on, which is of course intrinsically linked to empire, intrinsically linked to monarchy. And I would think that for all her faults, probably the Queen is probably the only person in British public life who actually understands what the Commonwealth is. Her prime ministers don't, her family I don't think do either, but she does, because she was there in 48 at this transition. And it's interesting, as I sometimes do with my students, to compare and contrast this with other European empires that didn't succeed in creating such a organization. So, but it's almost like it is either a devil's bargain or a symbiotic relationship, in the sense we're only talking about Commonwealth Day in some respects because there's monarchy involved, which gives it a publicity that it otherwise wouldn't have. And but in some ways, to close my brief comments, I was intrigued by another development which was not as reported on in the news, but I found in some ways more disturbing in terms of the Commonwealth as a wider organization, was the fact that in 2018 the Queen, for who almost always keeps her opinions to herself, but in 2018 at the London Commonwealth meeting, the Queen said it was her dearest wish that her son Prince Charles succeed her as head of the Commonwealth when that time comes. Whereas if we go back to that 1952 moment where we saw, as someone said before, the coronation chair, it was said that this was almost there by acclamation rather than by hereditary right. And that has once again blurred the lines between Crown and Commonwealth, despite the fact that there are an overwhelming majority of republics in the organization.
Thank you very much indeed, Harshan. And I know what you mean about the music yesterday. I think my take-home message from that was what a great songwriter Burt Bacharach is. Anyway, Kate, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. And of course, I'll preface my comments by saying I'm not a historian of the royal family or of the Commonwealth, but of the Caribbean. So I'm going to speak from that perspective. I'd like to rephrase the question that you gave us in our briefing, if I may. And I think that the way the question is posed puts the emphasis on the importance of the Commonwealth to the royal family, and also assumes that the Commonwealth, either as an institution or as individual member states, feels a strong connection to the royal family, which is, of course, not universally the case. So I'd like to answer not why is there such a strong connection between the royal family and the Commonwealth, and why is that connection so important, but should there be a connection between the Commonwealth and the royal family at all? Where are the voices of the Commonwealth nations in this? And indeed, is there a connection as far as the peoples of the Commonwealth are concerned? My own view is that there should not be a connection between the royal family and the institution of the Commonwealth. If it was an anachronism at the birth of the Commonwealth, then it's even more of an anachronism now. Regional bodies, including ones where there's a significant overlap of membership with the Commonwealth nations, such as the ACP, so the African, Caribbean and Pacific group of nations, are perfectly able to function without a monarchical head. There's a rotating head, rotating section heads elected by their constituent member states, rotating around the region. And there are no arguments about the need for stability or continuity of leadership. And, however flawed such supranational organizations may be, I think there's plenty of precedents and examples that the Commonwealth could draw on if it wants to democratize its structures and articulate its role. So I think that in itself, the link with the monarchy exposes the weaknesses of the Commonwealth rather than its putative strengths. Secondly, and as I think we're going to come on to later in the discussion, individual member states of the Commonwealth are making moves to break ties with the Crown. And in the case of Barbados, for example, this is of course explicitly tied or explicitly being framed as part of a wider project of decolonization. Mia Mottley has stated, the time has come to leave our colonial past behind. And she recalled the words of Barbados's first Prime Minister, Errol Barrow, who warned against, quote, loitering on colonial premises. So I'd say that the project of secondary decolonization in the Caribbean is a very important one. It's an ongoing one. And I think it's one that the Commonwealth as an institution, if it wants to move with the tides of history, ought to be engaged in. The Commonwealth has been loitering on colonial premises for some time, or maybe it's a monarchy that has been loitering on Commonwealth premises for too long. But there's nothing more emblematic of that colonial link than the connection to the royal family. So yes, I think there's a strong case for a project of secondary decolonization, both at the level of the Commonwealth as an institution and at the level of its member states where they wish to cut the links with the Crown. And in some cases we have indications of public opinion heading in that direction. I mean, we've heard, I think, from Anna about polls in New Zealand and Australia, but the most recent poll in Jamaica, which was in March 2020, had 55% of the population wishing to rid of the Queen as the head of state. Lastly, just in terms of the question of importance, looking at it from the perspective of the Commonwealth nations, if you look at today's editions of the major Caribbean newspapers, there's minimal reference to Commonwealth Day, and as Harshan has pointed out, this can partly be explained by the fact that Commonwealth days are celebrated on different days in different places, but where it was mentioned, which is in one Barbados and one Jamaican newspaper, it was the same sort of syndicated article. And what it made reference to was, first of all, the controversies around Baroness Scotland, and secondly, the challenges of the Commonwealth as an institution. Where the royals were mentioned in the press today in the Caribbean at all, it's the Meghan and Harry story, again, a kind of a sort of cut and paste from Reuters. So the Commonwealth might be important to the royals, but I would contend that it probably has much less resonance to some of its member states.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. And finally, we come on to Ed Owens. Ed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip, again, for inviting me to talk as part of this panel this evening. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Yep. I was struck by a couple of things watching the service actually on repeat over lunch today. And I'd like to highlight a few things in relation to sort of continuities and discontinuities in terms of the history that I've explored of the monarchy, both in terms of old research and new. My book, the second chapter of that book, looked at the Christmas message of King George V in the 1930s and how very carefully he and a group of sort of courtiers and royal advisors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, developed very carefully a specific sort of vocabulary through which they described empire and increasingly also Commonwealth as well. A language sort of based on unity, on community, the themes of sort of helping out and reaching out to others, an emphasis actually on technology transcending space and time to bring a global community closer together. We heard all of this in the Queen's message yesterday. All of those sort of similar refrains were there. So there are a lot of continuity dating back almost 100 years, which I find somewhat remarkable. I thought the theme of that message, the theme of unity in adversity with the pandemic, fascinating, because I think it also pointed at some of the more problematic elements as well of the way that message was constructed, and also how the video that played on top of the message was constructed as well. Notably, the video track drew a lot of focus to what we would have once termed the colonial world, as opposed to what we would have once termed the white dominions. So a lot of focus on Asian and African nations, with an emphasis on the role of health carers, the role of teachers, people that have been on the front line of the pandemic. And yet, just to look a bit more closely at what's going on in those nations, you see that there is huge disparities in terms of the response to the pandemic, in terms of a vaccine rollout. Yet all of that was sort of conveniently sort of hidden away and disguised by what was quite an impressive piece of videography. So I think that was one of the things that struck me watching the film. I actually thought an interesting point of discontinuity was that the Queen didn't use the phrase family of nations to describe the Commonwealth in that message. I've always found that phrase that was something that was of this 1930s moment originally, quite cloying and at times, frankly, patronizing. And I wondered that given how much disparity and inequality there really is in terms of the vaccine response within the Commonwealth, just how things are so different, maybe referring to the group as a group of equals, sort of based on family ties, I thought that might have been the reason why it wasn't used in this particular instance. Just a couple of final thoughts relating to my current project, and that is I'm looking at independence ceremonies in African nations at the moment of handover, focusing from the late 50s through the 60s. In all of the media coverage of these events that I've been looking at, four things dominate: music, dancing, singing, and sport. These four things, I think more than anything, were part of this narrative that unfolded last night in Westminster Abbey, with an emphasis on elevating, if you like, cultural themes that appear to unite this Commonwealth of ordinary people, or notably there were these extraordinary representatives of ordinary people. Just to draw that thought to a close, I thought, as is so characteristic of these moments, the politics of Commonwealth was again conveniently neglected. The hard politics of Commonwealth, questions over human rights, for example, just wasn't there really. There was some discussion of the good cultural work that can be done through education, through health work, etc. But I thought the high politics of Commonwealth was really missing. And I wondered, in terms of the representatives that had been chosen to front this programme, people like James Massia, Anita Rani, June Sarpong, Denise Lewis, etc. This was a very British interpretation of Commonwealth. And I wondered to myself, all of those people that were in the programme very much are legacies of Commonwealth, and they were given a space to express and talk openly about Commonwealth in different ways. I just wonder, there's something quite uncomfortable about that, given how much focus the Black Lives Matter movement has focused on the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of imperialism. I was left wondering, there's something something uncomfortable here about inviting, if you like, British representatives whose lives have been distinctly shaped by Empire and Commonwealth to come on and present this programme as though that legacy was that didn't really matter. If the legacies of Empire, again, carefully not really engaged with. So I was left. I wrote a question down to myself: is the monarchy's way of dealing with these uncomfortable legacies of Empire to create a space for the expression and celebration of people whose very existence have been so profoundly shaped by Empire and decolonisation, such as the representatives that we saw on the television?
Thank you very much, Ed. We've got, this has given us a number of different leads, which I want to take up in the discussion. I just remind everyone in the audience to use chat to ask questions. I think I'll read in general comments, but if you can line up some questions to the panel, that would be really helpful. But in terms of the comments that have come in, Carl Wright and Geoffrey Hyland are both making quite similar points, that in a sense, we're not seeing the wood for the trees, really. I think in their view, that there were some really positive messages in the broadcast yesterday. Prince Charles' focus on health workers during COVID, climate and environment. And Jeffrey Hunt says, I saw a TV program which is positive, multicultural, and showcased many different aspects of the modern Commonwealth. I think we might agree with that, but I think just sort of really coming back to Ed, I mean, what is so interesting about the way that Ed writes about the formation of the Christmas broadcasts from the 30s onwards was the way in which they were crafted. They were fine-tuned to get the tone exactly right. And it was, it was a process of trial and error, really. I mean, you might have thought that George V was safe in the hands of Rudyard Kipling, who was brought in to draft the first one, but Kipling just got the tone wrong in a way. It was too grandiose. A.A. Milne was brought in, was too mawkish. And it was kind of Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who kind of got this quite intimate tone. And I think that it's the tone that we're talking about, really. That there were certain things which just seemed to jar in the way, in the kind of the language and the presentation, and as Alice would say, the kind of the performative aspect of this. And I mean, I reckon there's probably someone in this audience who knows a bit about who was actually responsible for putting that broadcast together. If anyone does have some high grade gossip on this, feel free to come out of the shadows. Just tell me in chat that you'd like to speak. But sort of, yeah, coming back to Ed, just on this point, who do you think put the broadcast together? Does it look like a series of rather sort of tired tropes from earlier speeches? Was there any attempt to kind of do that reinvention around the image of monarchy in the Commonwealth last night?
I'm slightly reluctant to sort of guess as to exactly who was behind the language that was used, especially in the message. But nevertheless, it was probably coordinated by certainly within the private secretaries, media strategists in and around the monarch herself, representatives of Commonwealth. It used to be the case that whenever these messages were made, they had to get sort of clearance from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office because they could often be treading on people's toes so there was often, they were highly scrutinized before they'd go out. I think in terms of yesterday's message, what was I think quite striking to me was that it was quite banal. It didn't go into too much detail. It was very sort of broad in its appeal, and as I say, it touched on many familiar notes. I think we mustn't forget the role of the broadcaster in all of this, as well as the setting, something I'm personally very interested in. Westminster Abbey lent, it's the perfect stage for this kind of performance to unfold in. Historically speaking, the religious ministers in charge of that space have always played a role in overseeing the ceremonial that unfolds within it. So I don't think we want to forget about them entirely either. But what about the BBC? I mean, what was the BBC's brief going into this? I imagine, where are we now? The pandemic's been going on about 12 months. They've probably been thinking about this for the best part of the last year as to how are they going to put on a Commonwealth Day event given the restrictions of COVID. These things are often months, if not years in the making, and there's a lot of forethought that goes into them. So I imagine the discussion has been fairly continuous. I think given everything that has been going on, the discussion about exactly what was going to be contained in the program was probably running right until the last minute of filming, because they didn't want to do anything that would be at all controversial. So I think that we have to take seriously the sort of the range of actors that have been involved in the kind of reinvention of monarchy that we saw last night. This very specific sort of public demonstration of what Commonwealth means. I think it, as I say, it bore all the hallmarks of an older version of Commonwealth, and yet at the same time, I think played to a very British audience in terms of the selection and the cast of actors who were chosen to present and front the programme.
Thank you. Anna would like to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to come in and echo the point about the BBC. I mean, I think that, you know, the media and the monarchy are obviously very necessary bedfellows, and the BBC in particular. I mean, just having sort of worked with them in the past, I mean, they are so reverential when it comes to the monarchy, and I'm not surprised that was the way that they did that program at all. I mean, it was an outing of the establishment in every sense, the British establishment. And I think that, you know, they weren't going to push back on, I mean, it would have been a collaboration between the BBC producers that would have had to have won the trust of all the various royal, participants, and of course, the director of communications and so on. And it's not going to push back. No one's going to say, you know, that this isn't how, you know, perhaps you're being perceived like this. No one's going to say that. And I would have thought that from their point of view, and this is the kind of worrying bit perhaps, that it would be seen as a job well done, that it was a great program that celebrated and showcased, good work across the Commonwealth. It looked like there was a rapport on the part of the royals with the people over the Zoom that they were talking to. And I suspect that people are even saying, you know, hasn't the pandemic been a great leveler? There is everybody on Zoom engaging and interacting with themselves. But I think actually what was quite striking is that even over Zoom, even though everybody was on that sense on the same platform, the sort of disparity between the royals in London and those that they were talking to was huge. And, you know, does the head of the Commonwealth simply need to shine a light on areas of the Commonwealth and give them a platform that they otherwise wouldn't get, or what is the point? I think, you know, we're touching on the question of the Queen's identification with the Commonwealth, and I think that is kind of easier to understand and easy to read. I'd be interested in what others think, but I mean, although I don't think that an inherited position of Charles taken over as head of the Commonwealth is a good idea, I do ironically think that Charles, in some sense, is well placed to champion values that do kind of that are global, not least environmentalism. I mean, he could go quite large on environmentalism, and that could give him a kind of legitimate platform to speak beyond the UK. But I think that, you know, for the reasons that we're kind of touching on, really the association with the monarchy going forward is going to be problematic. And as Philip's pointed out, I think in his book, I mean, you've talked, Philip, about how the royals, the Queen, is relatively easy about the idea of countries becoming republics within the Commonwealth. It's not, so she's kind of relaxed about the attachment of whether she's Queen or not, but she's much less relaxed about the idea of the Commonwealth as an organisation fracturing. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that's where her emphasis and her priority is. It's the organisation, it's not her status as head of state across the Commonwealth, which is the point, of course, that Alice was making too.
Yeah, I mean, Alice was talking about sort of kind of disambiguating these various areas of monarchy and Commonwealth. So let's do that and just focus first on the headship. And we face the problem that historians of modern British monarchy have in general, I think, in that basically we're talking about a particular person. We're talking about the Queen. She is the modern monarchy. she's been around as long as most people, you know, in this country can remember. And she effectively created the headship. Okay, the title was established for George the Sixth, but really just as a device to allow India to remain in the organization as a republic. The Queen turned it into a ceremonial role. In fact, it was only really recognized as a proper role in 2018 when arrangements were made for it to be passed to her successor. It's all about her. And I think, you know, I want to sort of throw this to Harshan really first, about her role, because in a sense, again, she's not a symbol, she's a player. And I think that makes her role all the more important. She's a kind of, she was part of that almost first generation of new Commonwealth leaders. She was first generation new Commonwealth. And her meeting alongside people like Kenyatta and Makarios and Nkrumah and Nyerere was a very powerful symbol of reconciliation. And you search in vain in the records for any indication that she opposed transfers of power or regretted them seriously. As Anna said, she's always had a very consistent role that, you know, it's entirely a matter for the countries concerned whether they become republics. She's sort of played a personal role in that, which is why she is kind of, she sort of transcends, if you like, the symbolism of monarchy. Is it going to be more difficult for her son, who hasn't had that active role in the decolonization process, to take on the headship of the Commonwealth? I'll go to Harshan first, but if anyone else would like to pick up on this, let me know.
Thank you, Philip. It's a very good question. I think, as you say, that first generation of independence leaders that you mentioned from the 50s, 60s onwards was critical. And as you say, literally the same age group as many of those leaders. In many ways, they legitimized each other in some ways, playing a role because they validated the other. I mean, because you could argue, you know, that with no disrespect to Belgium, but it'd be in some ways having like a monarchy of like, you know, just a provincial European monarchy as opposed to an international one, which the Crown at least liked to portray itself through this Commonwealth role. So it gave a much larger world role for the monarch, both as head of Commonwealth and but especially as Queen. That, you know, again, yes, that say if I use my example of Belgium is not as pronounced a case, and in fact, you know, some have made the arguments, for example, in the wonderful oral history project that Philip has promoted, people like Bob Hawke and others have said that you know, in some ways the Republic part is actually gives a greater allowance for the Queen to promote her interests, rightly or wrongly, because in a constitutional monarchy, she is restricted by conventions and sometimes laws and what she can and can't do. Whereas in the republics, and again to emphasize, there are more republics in the Commonwealth by a great deal than there are realms. That's there. So there's no constitutional relationship between, say, the Queen in South Africa or India, in a way there is with Wellington or Kingston. And just as Ed has made the point about George V, and you can keep going back as well as potentially forward, each sovereign will have a different way of looking at these things. I mean, there's and as British history has shown, how someone acts as the heir or Prince of Wales is sometimes different how they are when they're monarch. And Charles, at least I think, sees that legitimizing role that the Commonwealth can give to him, echoing what Kate's point about what the Commonwealth does for the monarchy. And that there's no reason to think that he won't try to do the same in terms of enhancing his international standing.
Thanks very much. I want to go to Kate and Alice with a sort of a question, which, I mean, you know, Kate, you were talking about this process of sort of secondary decolonization, move to Republican status. I remember a few years ago, we had the Judge Patrick Robinson from the West Indies, very distinguished Caribbean jurist, who was speaking at the Institute about the kind of dual moves in Jamaica to supposedly to move towards Republican status, but also end appeals to the Privy Council. And he was using this, you know, fantastically emotive rhetoric about breaking the chains of colonial oppression. And I just sort of, at the end, I kind of got up and said, well, look, you know, Ghana did it in 1960, Tanzania did it in 1961 or 62. What took you so long? And that I suppose is the big question for the Caribbean. Why is it that you know, so many of the realms are still in the Caribbean region? Why is the Crown proved so apparently popular, certainly long-lived? Is it to do with the kind of the early modern roots of the Crown in the Caribbean? I mean, maybe Kate, if you could go first. Is it a popular institution?
Sorry, just unmuting. I mean, I think these are exactly the kind of questions that we want to answer with the project. So in terms of that independence moment, then, you know, some of the standard explanations in the literature relate to, you know, the socialization of Caribbean political leaders into the kind of norms and values of Westminster liberal democracy, and you know, the whole kind of transplantation of the Westminster model. If it's good enough for England, it's good enough for us. Or the explanations have rested on assumptions about, you know, residual Caribbean loyalty to the Crown, and, you know, you can sort of look to history where, you know, the Crown had a role as the entity to which you could appeal over the heads of the oppressive planters, etc. So, you know, appeal to Queen Victoria for better treatment, the whole kind of myth of Victoria's role in emancipation, etc. I mean, these are the kind of assumptions that we really want to test with the project. I can speak to the three that did become republics in the 70s. So Guyana, then Trinidad and Tobago, and then Dominica. That takes place under, excuse me, during a particular kind of historical conjuncture of the 1970s, and they're all in some way tied to some kind of nationalist project, be that cooperative socialism in Guyana or to independence in Dominica, where they were the only Caribbean nation to move simultaneously to Republican status and independence status at the same time. I mean, in terms of the contemporary Caribbean, you know, the fact is the cutting ties with the Crown is a mainstream position. It's the recommendation of all constitutional reform committees since constitutional reform committees have been held in the post-independence Caribbean, with the exception of one, which is in Belize, where they couldn't come to a consensus position which relates to Belize's specific issue of Guatemala's claim to all of Belize, where it was felt that that connection to the crown offered them a kind of safety in the form of, you know, the presence of British troops, etc., etc. So all constitutional commissions since the 70s onwards to the present day have recommended that the Caribbean states move to being republics. Now, the question is, why has that not been implemented? And that's the question that I think you're getting at. And again, there's different reasons in different contexts. So and I think this speaks to one of the questions in the chat about referenda. So where it has been put to a referenda, which has most recently been in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2009, that was as part of a kind of wider package of constitutional reform measures, which then foundered on partisan politics. So because the constitutional reform project was so deeply tied to the political agenda of Ralph Gonsalves' party, in the end, the opposition campaigned against it, and the whole constitution, including the decision to go to a republic, did not pass. In the case of Jamaica recently, so it is in the election manifesto of the JLP, who just won by a landslide in September 2020. They put into their manifesto that they will hold what they call a grand referendum on a number of constitutional issues, which explicitly included the role of the Queen of Head of State. But they've put that in a language that doesn't make them a hostage to fortune. So it just says at an appropriate time that a referendum will be held. And the opposition JLP also made a commitment in the run-up to the 2020 election that should they be elected, they would take steps immediately to start the process of delinking from the crown. And constitutionally, you do not need to have a referendum to cut the ties with the crown. So in the case of the 3 republics in the Caribbean, none of them did it by a referendum. Dominica did it as part of independence negotiations. Guyana did it by passing a bill through Parliament. So did Trinidad. You don't need a referendum. So in a way, the JLP is handing the decision over to the people rather than kind of taking the step themselves to come out strongly and say, we will do it. They're saying this is an issue for the people to decide because there's an issue. It's controversial or sensitive, or the country's divided on it.
And so there's a question in the chat about whether Megan's comments about alleged racism will strengthen republicanism. Is it likely to have an impact in the Caribbean, do you think?
Yes, I think it will, is the short answer to that. Although I would also say that, you know, it doesn't come as a shock to people in the Caribbean that the royal family be accused of racism. So I think it's just, this is just one recent example, but because the wedding of Meghan and Harry did get considerable coverage in the Caribbean, and Harry had been to the Caribbean fairly recently, so he was quite well received in Belize, for example. So I would certainly say that the current situation with Meghan will not do the royal family any favors in the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to bring in Alice, and then I'll come back to Anna. Alice, again, you know, sort of looking at this from a sort of an early modernist perspective, are those sort of centuries-old links with the Caribbean important, do you think? And why are we still so fascinated by the royals? What is it about monarchy, even in this country, still has this sort of this power which has apparently contributed to its survival?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I think we chose to focus on the Caribbean for the project is that it is a particular case within the Commonwealth. I mean, 9 9 nations there. 9 of the 16 are in the Commonwealth realms are in the Caribbean, and it has got the, you know, its history goes back so far. I mean, interesting though with Barbados, who were one of the earliest, and pledged to royalist with the revolution, and fought on the side for Charles I. But then it was Jamaica that was secured under Cromwell, and Charles II decided that to keep on Jamaica. It's a really long history, and that must I think count for something. And one of the things that, of course, we want to look at in the project is trying to understand those kind of those long kind of those ties, and how they felt in different nations. Because I think you can assume that it's the same across the Caribbean and within different age groups. And the tradition of the kind of visibility or not of the monarch there. I mean, they couldn't travel. Surely one of the successes is when Britannia was able to kind of get into these small ports and islands, and this foreigner was visible. And footage often comments on that. Someone's coming from afar, and that wasn't the case, but there was a presence symbolically of the monarch. Stamps and coins and flags, this visible presence for a long time, and that those things matter, I think. As for what is it about monarchy, well, there's the question which I'm not sure anyone can ever get to, because at one point it would be, it's because they're mysterious. You don't really know them or see them, so it's that kind of mystery, and you've got to keep them kind of slightly removed. And this kind of charisma that they have, but you can't quite get at them, they kind of pass through. And then with the kind of modernization of monarchy and being more visible, and the walkabout that the royal tours initiated, I mean, Elizabeth II initiated that, of them being more visible and touchable, didn't seem, some people said that's going to diminish their power, and it didn't. It seems to have had the opposite effect, that you can kind of shake their hand, and people still talk. They go a little bit misty-eyed when they talk about having come into contact with royalty, wherever it is. I don't know if that is clever coverage. There are plenty of people who aren't responding like that, but there is this kind of royal touch, which goes back centuries. A kind of magic, and it's difficult to account for that when you're on the one hand talking to people, and people we've met or we've spoken to, who kind of say on the one hand, we should be a republic. This was someone from Jamaica. We should be a republic. It's nonsense that our head of state is a lovely woman, but who lives miles and miles and miles away. And on the other hand, would say how much respect they have for her, and actually feel kind of were touched when they met her, and kind of felt that was a real special moment. So that it's there, and it has always been there.
I mean, there's a really sort of interesting discussion again in Ed's book about the relationship of monarchy to celebrity. That again, there was within the palace, there is a distrust of celebrity in a sense, because of the assumption that celebrities enjoy being famous, whereas the royals are forced to be famous, and they suffer for it, but that's their duty. And maybe this is why the kind of the Meghan and Harry affair are so damaging. I mean, she is a kind of, she is a celebrity. I mean, she clearly is at ease with that public persona, and is a very intelligent and articulate person. So she kind of confounds the sense of the way that the royals have positioned themselves as somehow kind of ordinary but famous. And she's this kind of notion that she is the victim of racism from the royal family. Again, short circuits this trope of the monarch as the sort of the suffering servant of the people. Ed, any thoughts on? I mean, because when I was reading your book, I was thinking of Meghan. So tell me, was I wrong?
I'm gonna try and join the two the 2 points together if I can.
Yeah.
In terms of this this ongoing sort of obsession and fascination with royalty, what it is that draws us to them, and whether we can link that to the kind of the front page sort of drama that's currently unfolding. I think, to pick up on Alice's point, there remains a sort of unknowability and mystery to the royal family, which I think is extremely important to why so many people are tuned into their lives. Whether there is quite the realization that we really don't know who they are. I think this is a point that I make in my book. There is a great performance of them as ordinary people, as people just like us, but actually we know very little about their private lives, what their individual sort of personalities are actually like. We get a flavor of that, but the media never really goes there, and I think that's a little disconcerting. So we're fed often a story that we can get close and intimate to these individuals via the media narrative, but I think ultimately, I think we have to accept that they are quite inscrutable as well. But clearly the media coverage is key. To come back to this story of the sort of the suffering royal, I think there were fears initially when Meghan came into the family about her version of celebrity possibly cheapening the royal image, as has often been the case when there has been too great a flirtation with other forms of celebrity among the sort of the core group of Windsors. We saw it with Princess Margaret, sort of living the high life in the 1960s and early 1970s with her fairly bohemian set. So there are constant, I think, concerns about who it is the core group of royals are associating with. In terms of Meghan, her story in many ways is very old and in some ways is very new. I think the race dimension is what distinguishes Meghan's story as a news story. And yet this idea of royals sort of speaking out about their personal hardships, the difficulties they're experiencing in their private lives, often to do with intrusive press coverage. This isn't new at all. This is something that King George VI did very deliberately in order to try and win the sympathy and sort of affection of the British public after coming to the throne the end of 1936 and just not being a very popular king. And you can see this in the mass observation personal testimonies written by ordinary members of the public who don't have a great deal of feeling for him, but if they feel anything for him, they feel sorry for him. And that's because he's very good at publicizing, well, he and his courtiers are very good at publicizing just how difficult his life is as this very burdened king. Now, that reaches its apotheosis in the figure of Queen Elizabeth II, and it's taken on a sort of form of a new current in the figures of her grandchildren. William was, I think, quite pioneering in this respect, talking out very publicly as a younger man about how the death of his mother had affected him. Now, of course, these are real events, and there is a trauma and a tragedy at work there. And yet, at the same time, the way that the grief and the suffering is publicized is a very deliberate act to evoke public affection and public empathy for the image of the suffering royal. And I think, well, what we will be watching later on tonight on ITV is probably the greatest manifestation of that to date.
Thank you very much. And Anna, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I guess just a few points. I mean, I think there's a difference that the monarchy needs to get its head around about being seen to champion mental health, but also then deal with mental health in its own ranks. And I think that's where, this is an issue of somebody who clearly was in a state of profound emotional and mental distress, as Diana was. How does the family, the firm, the palace, HR handle it. And at the very least, I think there can be a charge leveled there. I mean, just to pick up on a couple of other points I wanted to make, just one thing when we went thinking about Prince Harry and reactions in the Commonwealth and attitudes over time, I was reminded of the hashtag Not My Prince, which did the rounds when Harry went to the Caribbean in 2016. And it was this anti-colonial social media campaign, basically talking about who is this white privileged man coming over expecting us to line the route. And they found his sort of, I think one of the quotes said from the campaign at the time, Prince Harry brings the combined mystique of whiteness, celebrity, power and wealth. In return, he's greeted with the usual pomp and circumstance. He'll be feted with military parades. And so there was a real pushback at that time about Prince Harry, which I think is quite interesting. I'd also, one of the things I think that we're going to be exploring in our project is the issue of gender and the importance or not of the fact that the monarch at the time of this process of decolonization, and perhaps compared to also Queen Victoria during the period of colonization, of this sort of benign figure of a maternal, of a woman, would the Queen and the attachment and the association and the affection of the Queen and her success in keeping the Commonwealth together be different if it had been a male? So I think gender plays a role. And finally, I think I would draw an interesting distinction, or I think it's interesting and important rather, between celebrity and charisma. And I think that, royals need to be charismatic, but they shouldn't be seen as celebrities. And I think one of the differences is this idea of celebrity being quite self-serving and self-promoting. And the difficulty for the royals, and I think this is where Meghan found it really difficult, is Meghan had quite literally made a career out of self-promotion. I mean, she had to be. She was an influencer, she was an actress, she was on social media platforms promoting herself and so on. She then married into the royal family, and of course the brand is the royal one. Your identity is subsumed to that of the firm, to the royal family, and you're asked to be charismatic, but in a way that is quite different than simply being a celebrity. So I think there is a distinction there. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of pick up on, but the issue of gender, I think, is a particularly interesting one. And we when we look back on our most important, significant, successful monarchs, I think women do feature. And in the context of the question of the Commonwealth, I think gender is an important factor to underpin that continued association, and may indeed be the reason why it doesn't survive into the future, or one of the reasons, I think.
Thank you. And Alice, you wanted to come in? Did you?
Sorry, just unmuting. It was just on the language, and it picks up on something that Ed said about the use of the word family. And I think, as Anna said, gender is important, but this idea of the family and a mother and a sense of kind of mothering the family is a language that perhaps fits with that. I mean, it has a long history, of course, of monarchs who always have talked about themselves as the father and of the mother, and kind of been married to their country. It, I think, will become increasingly difficult for Charles to talk about. I don't know how that would fit. I mean, he actually did, I think, use the word family in the celebration yesterday. And at the time, I did kind of, it didn't maybe work quite so well, but I think gender is interesting and will have an effect on the kind of language that they might use to sort of describe this union, which we've all kind of said seems so important to them.
Alice, can I just feed you in a question from Peter Williams, which I think it raises an interesting point. Peter, who I'm sure, like a number of people in the audience, will have attended quite a few Commonwealth Day services. He says culture is one thing that the Commonwealth doesn't do collectively to any great extent, at any rate in terms of festivals and collective events. And I suppose anyone who's been to the Commonwealth Day services, I mean, Harshan and I went a few few years ago. Well, no, that they're kind of slightly zany affairs. You know, you get Rufus Wainwright doing a cover version of Leonard Cohen's Alleluia in the Abbey. And I remember one of a fairly sort of senior courtier once saying to me that actually, you know, so many of the things that the Queen does are very boring and repetitive. And you know, the service in the Abbey is certainly not that. There are always a few kind of oddities and surprises in there, but it's not really high culture. And you know, whereas the Tudor, you know, the Tudor monarchs were polymaths. They were like sort of Renaissance monarchs. You know, they were patrons of high culture. The Windsors are not really, are they? And the Commonwealth has always been, the modern Commonwealth, he's also had a slightly uneasy relationship to high culture. Do you want to comment on that point from Peter?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, he goes on to say, I mean, there is the book, you know, the book prize, and there the literacy programs, and the essay prize, which was promoted in a really, sorry, something's been sent through to a printer right beside me. Home working.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, the Tudor monarchs and the Stuarts presided over kind of court culture, I suppose, but they also you know, patronised what was also very popular. You know, Shakespeare was hugely popular, and it was because he was popular that James I thought he'd keep an eye on him and take him for himself. I was interested yesterday in the way, and this does happen in the past too, the way that culture gets reappropriated later and taken away from its kind of radical roots often. And, you know, Bob Marley yesterday and Aretha Franklin kind of covered, but I mean, this is something that you've actually written about, haven't you, Philip? The kind of there's kind of radical roots there. And then when they're kind of performed in Westminster Abbey, it kind of appropriates them as part of the kind of sort of conservative culture in a way. That's what I felt it was doing. Or perhaps more, on the other hand, it was acknowledging their past. I mean, it's a bit like kind of, you know, Milton, kind of the Republican writer, and yet now he's kind of one of the great. Often those kind of roots are taken away. But I actually think yesterday it was perhaps connecting with that. So I don't know if I've answered your question about kind of high culture, but I think with a kind of accessing culture that has spoken on behalf of those nations and has done interesting, radical, innovative things, is something that could be promoted.
Thank you very much. I want to sort of put a question to the modern historians, and really starting, Harshan, with the palace letters. I mean, a few people have said, you know, talked about the way in which the royals need to kind of maintain a certain distance, certain mystery. And I think there was almost an expectation before the palace letter. Well, just for anyone who doesn't know, these were letters between the Australian Governor General Kerr and Buckingham Palace between what, about 1970, 73, 78. So covering the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. And there was almost an expectation there that, you know, the Queen would be writing these very personal letters, giving instructions about undermining Gough Whitlam. There's nothing of that. I mean, the private secretary is the intermediary. Again, you don't get much of a sense of a personality at work. But why, Harshan, I'm sure that sort of the Palace Letters affair doesn't really rank in public attention next to the sort of the Meghan Harry stuff, but it has caused an awful lot of controversy. Why is it? Why was it such a major revelation? I mean, why was it and such a sort of political controversy as well?
Well, I think part of it goes back to a word that has been used throughout well, as we said, the day itself, as well as in our comments, and it's family in some ways, because these are in some ways seen as correspondence not between diplomatic governments or something, or official letters in that sense, but more between private letters. At least that's the argument, that they are almost between family members. Whereas, and in that vein, there is, along with the things about details about policy and so on, there's also a bit of gossip. But there is, I suppose, the controversy. Yes, on one hand, it's that this is not available for public scrutiny, or even for official scrutiny in some respects, because it's not like Australia in this case had everything that they required. This was the Australian side, if you like, although of course there was things from the palace. And I think it's but as you said yourself, Philip, in some ways the controversy was that there was no real controversy, in the sense there wasn't a smoking coronet in the in the letters, in the sense that the Queen saying, "Oh, this horrible leftist prime minister, let's get rid of him." I mean, I think that's what those who were trying to get the release of the letters were hoping to see, but it just wasn't there. And in some ways, it is a good reminder, as as perhaps as disappointing in some ways to some, for even like if we look at some of these Caribbean cases, that this is in many ways, these are cases where it's the local politics that counts. The Queen didn't make Gough Whitlam, didn't make John Kerr, her representative, sack the Australian Prime Minister, and this was done purely with Australian considerations. And even if Australia had been a republic, it may well have had been the same. And in a similar vein, these potential Republican movements in across the Caribbean and elsewhere, these will ultimately be decided there. It's not like obviously the Queen and the Palace would prefer these places to remain realms and so on. But and what's interesting, as inane as it may seem, is that there was such detailed information about everything from opening of hospitals to stud farms in Queensland and so on, and all the stuff going in and about personalities of particular ministers. So there was detailed information, but at the end it was still the actual decisions, the actual controversies were done by Australians themselves. But as we've been discussing before, and as some of us have seen, if we were looking at earlier sets of letters like Queen Victoria, they're going to be very different letters. She is very much taking an active interest in trying to influence local politics, and maybe King Charles will be the same.
But this is the particular problem that we have as sort of modern historians of the monarchy. Sources that just aren't available. And although this little prank that was played on some royal commentators yesterday or the day before, getting them to talk in advance about the interview that they hadn't seen. I mean, okay, they got caught out, but you feel there, but for the grace of God, because I'm sure that some of us will have been getting phone calls recently saying there's a senior member of the royal family in hospital, just stand by your telephones. And if anything happens, we have to pretend that we're kind of his best friend and we know everything about his life and how he thinks. And, that's how That's how the media works. And yet we're really starved for you know, good hard sources of historical evidence for the monarchy in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. How do we get round that as historians? What are the challenges? I mean, Ed, do you want to comment on this?
Well, unfortunately, I think by the time we get access to everything that will be sort of contained and put down on paper, present time, and probably over the last 20, 30 years, by the time we get access to most of that, I think most of us will be long gone, I'm afraid, Philip. That seems to be the norm here. A couple of points, just picking up again on what you both said there. I think the fascinating thing with engaging with any royal correspondence is that you've always got to read between the lines. You've got to read for absences and silences, because so often so little is committed to paper, especially when on topics that are slightly controversial. It tends to be a lot of things have been communicated often by telephone. I remember the number of times the palace end up reprimanding the BBC for the way that they've covered a royal wedding, or they've interfered at a royal christening. But even the way that those letters are written are done in such a way as to ensure that as you say, the monarch's voice never really comes through. It's very rare that we get glimpses of that. I mean, in terms of trying to research the last 50 years, I'm trying to do it via media sources. It's a comparison of a sort of a web of archives in and around the monarchy, institutions that they've historically engaged with, and it's trying to sort of determine where there is a paper trail to begin with, and then trying to piece together a story, if you like. It's a sort of a donut story, because the center remains very hollow. There is that absence of sort of information at the center as to what's going on with it, but sort of behind closed palace doors, which is ever so frustrating, but I suppose makes being a royal historian, having to, as I say, complete the rest of the puzzle through other archives, tantalizing in many respects.
That's a very positive way of putting it. Bad. We've gone a little bit over time, and that's just because the conversation has kept on flowing. But I know one of our panelists has got to leave soon, so we'd better wind it up there. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of the questions in the chat. But it's been a great discussion. Thank you so much to Alice, Kate, Harshan, Ed, Anna. Thanks for joining us